Today we're going to be learning Bava Metzia Daf Kaf Aleph. We'll finish the first chapter and begin the second. So we were in the middle of, and we're going to finish this up pretty quickly, the statement of Rav. If you remember, Rav said that if we're talking about receipts, if somebody has a receipt that somebody paid money and it ends up not in the hands of the person who paid the money, which is usually where it should be, but it was in the hands of the person who was collecting the money. So normally we would think that that means it wasn't, okay, well, that becomes the big question. Our Mishna actually said it doesn't matter. If it was written, we give it back to the person who paid. But Rav said, what are you talking about? No, we actually are concerned if it's in the hands of the person who was supposed to collect the money, they probably just prepared it so that they'd be ready when the person was actually going to pay the money, and they would say, here's your receipt. And that way, because remember, all they want to do is collect their money. So they want to make it easier to collect. So they have the receipt all ready to go. So then we brought three difficulties against Rav. The first one from our Mishnah and from two other Mishnayot that all seem to indicate we actually give it back to the other side. We assume it was paid. So how could Rav say it's not? To which we distinguished in all three cases based on the answer that Rav Safra gave in one case, and then we copied and pasted it to all the others, which is that it depends where you found it. If you found it with the creditor's torn documents, then obviously the creditor wasn't keeping it for later in order to use, which means it must have been used already, which means the loan must have been paid back. And that helps explain our Mishnah and the other sources according to Rav. Rav was talking about when it was found, as we said yesterday, like in the file cabinet of the Malveh, where put it with all the important papers, and then obviously it was meant to be used. Now we're going to have two further questions from two other sources, tannaitic sources, but we're going to answer them differently. Tashma, simpon sheyesh alav edim yitkayim b'chotamav. We're at the bottom of Kaf Amud Bet, the last line. If you have a simpon, which is a receipt that has witnesses signed on it, well, if yitkayim b'chotamav. Now we've seen this term many times. What does it mean? We saw it in Gitin a lot. We basically ratify the signatures. If the signatures are good, then we assume it's a valid document. Now, this doesn't make any sense according to Rav. What did Rav say? If it could be a valid document, but it could be that the Malveh, the creditor, hasn't yet used it. They're just having it prepared. So he had the witnesses signed, so it's all ready to go, and can give it when the person gives the money back. So how do they answer this? Ema yitkayem mechotamav. They switch one word, one letter. Instead of bechotamav, by its signatures, it says mechotamav, from the ones who signed. What does that mean? What do we do? If we don't know what to do with this document, we find it in the hands of the Malveh, let's say, or we find it on the street and we have no idea what the story is. So we look for the witnesses. We go find the people who signed. And if they can vouch for the fact that, oh yeah, we saw the borrower return the money to the creditor, then it's collected. And if they don't, then it's not. And then that fits perfectly with Rav. Tashma, last source. Simpon sheyesh alav edim kashel. If you have a simpon with witnesses signed, it's good. So that sounds like the same thing as the previous before we resolved it, which sounds like, first of all, it doesn't say yitkayem bichotamav that we could switch to mechotamav. So how are you going to explain this? This just sounds like you have a receipt with signatures on it, edim signed, it's valid. To which they answer, my edim, edei kiyum. No, edim means that it was actually, we have witnesses that say that it was ratified in the court. Now, it's only going to be ratified in the court once it's actually been used. So that must be what happened here. And Hachinami Mistaber, we can further prove this explanation because midekatani seifa. Look at the next line in that braita. It says, or a line in the braita, probably it's the next, V'she'en alav edim pasul. So if you have a simpon with edim, it's kasher. If you have one without witnesses, it's disqualified. Now, without witnesses, it's disqualified. Okay, obviously it's disqualified without witnesses. If I have a receipt that says so-and-so paid me money and nobody signed at it, well, I could just write that in my backyard. That doesn't mean anything. That's a totally irrelevant document. I don't need my analav edim, ilem deleke edim klal. If it didn't have any edim signed on it, you need to tell me it's disqualified. It's obviously disqualified. What's that's just a note written without any kind of validation whatsoever. Therefore, what must it mean? elalav edei kiyum. It must mean that it wasn't ratified by the court. And then again, this means if we find it somewhere where it's not the right place and it wasn't ratified by the court, then you can't rely on it. So that didn't contradict Rav anyway, because this wasn't talking about, this was talking about, again, the case where yesh alav edim and it's kasher means it was ratified by the court. And then it's clear that it was already paid back. Gufa. Now we're going to go back into the first braita we started with today, read the rest of that braita and learn it, and that's it. And with that, we'll finish the chapter. A gufa means we're going to go back to something we mentioned. If already we're on this, well, let's teach you something else. Simpon sheyesh alav edim yitkeim b'chotamav. So that we already saw. That's the first line of that braita. Ein alav edim, case 2 is, it doesn't have witnesses, v'yotzei mitachat yidei shalish, but it's not in the hands of the malveh, right? If it's in the hands of the loveh, the borrower, obviously it's valid. If it's in the hands of the malveh, that was our whole big question. It's not what they're talking about. It's not in the hands of the creditor. It's not that we found it on the street, but we found it by a third party. So there was a loan between two people, and they gave the document, the shovar, the receipt, to some third party. Now, if that's the case, and the third party vouches for the fact that it was paid back, then we trust that third party. So now we're going to explain these cases, okay? Oh, and the third case is, shiyotzei la'achar chitum shtarot kasher. What does that mean? Well, we've been talking right now about a receipt, which is a separate document. So normally what we said you do is you have the shtar chov, the IOU. Usually you'd rip that, and then you'd write a receipt and give the receipt to the borrower so that they could prove if the creditor ever tried to get the money back, they would say, oh, here's my receipt, I paid. But sometimes what they would do is they would take the original document, they wouldn't tear it up, the IOU, and they would write underneath, that's what it says, achar chitum shtarot. After the signatures on the document that says IOU, X amount of money, witnesses signed, underneath it they would write, and it's now paid back, and they would sign it. So if that's the case, then kasher, then we can assume it was definitely paid. So now we're going to go through those two cases and explain why. Yotzei mitachat yidei shalish. Why? Tahahem ne'malve, the shalish. Because why did you give this to the third party? The third party was, it's like sometimes you write a contract and you say, we all agree that if we have a disagreement, we'll go to this arbitrator, right? Obviously, if they relied on this person, even the malve relied on this person, which means that, right, the lender, the creditor, which means that whatever that person says is believed by both parties, and therefore we trust them. And the last case, if you sign at the bottom of the document, the IOU, the malva, the main thing the malva has always is the shtar. That's what the malva has, his IOU document, his promissory note. That's the main way he's going to get his stuff back. Now, he might write a receipt and get it ready so that he could say, here it is. But he'll never write in the document itself unless it was already paid back. Because otherwise, the creditor knows this will majorly mess him or her up if it says it was paid back. There's no way they'll get it. So therefore, there's no way they would have weakened. That's what meira means, like from the lashon of ra, bad, like weakening. There's no way he would make this shtar worse and weaken it by writing in it if it really hadn't happened. And therefore, remember, the shtar is in the malve's domain. So therefore, that's why we're going to believe and assume that it must have been paid back at that point. And with that, Hadran alach shnayim ochazin, and we're starting the second chapter. A few words of introduction before we get to the second chapter, before we start. The first thing is, this is one of the basic masechtot that kids learn as like a first chapter, this chapter. Okay, this chapter, not this masechet. There's many things in this masechet that are very challenging and difficult. First of all, it already shows this is a pretty easy chapter. Again, easy is relative, and also some lines may be easier, some pages, some might be a little more challenging, but overall, it's a pretty easy chapter. It's one of the first, this one and the fourth parak of brachot are very popular chapters. I think you can tell me what you think when you're done with it. But again, one is probably the material is a little bit easier. Number two, I think what's really interesting about this, different, I would say, than the fourth chapter of brachot, is that this is material that you can really think about in a real active way in terms of we find things on the street all the time, and we need to know, when do you have to return it? When do you not? It's very easy to think about. And in fact, I remember many, many years ago, I taught in high school, and I actually was looking for something else, for some chart I had then, which I couldn't find, but I thought maybe I just dreamed up that I had done it. But I went looking back and I saw it was already 26 years ago that I first taught this. But it's, I did a great activity the first day of class, which was I put all sorts of items on the ground in the classroom, and everybody had to figure out if they found the item in that way, what would they do with it? Could they take it? Would they have to return it? Would they be able to keep it? Okay, and it was a great way to already get into the Masechet and think about all the issues that we were going to discuss. So I want to start with a bit of an introduction about what are the main issues we're going to discuss in this chapter. So you find a lost item, okay? And now I kind of separated this for myself into two tracks, and then within that, we're going to kind of go down almost like a flow chart. So I find an item. The question is it lost or is it not? That's the first thing, right? Depending on how it's placed, it might give, if we saw some of these ideas already in the previous chapter, it might be that the person put it there on purpose and wants to come back for it, right? So I have to decide, is this, number one, a lost item or is it not a lost item? If it's not a lost item, then obviously I can't do anything with it. If it is a lost item, then I have to take it, but take it and do what with it, right? Then it goes into two tracks. Take it and keep it, because finders, keepers, losers, weepers. And, this item this person's never going to come back for this item because no way, right? And then the question is why? And then you have to figure out, well, let's say it doesn't have any identifying marks. The owner is we're going to assume, now this is going to be a big question today, at what point, but we're going to assume that the owner is going to have, and we're going to go back to this big sugya about yeyush that we talked about a lot in Bava Kama when it came to theft. This is it's a similar kind of yeyush, but it's a different ramification of it. If the owner despairs of ever getting the item back, then the item becomes hefker, ownerless. And if it's ownerless, well, then I can take it and I can keep it. So that's the big question. If I can take it, if I do pick it up, I can pick it up and keep it as my own if I assume the owner despaired of it. Now the question is, well, today we're going to see, what if the owner didn't despair now, but despairs down the road? Does that work to say there's retroactive despair, almost like braita? It's not exactly like braita, but it's similar. That something that will happen later will indicate really that if he had known right now, or she had known right now that it fell, they would have despaired already, which means it's now ownerless. Or do we have to say no? It's only once we know they despair that I can keep it. That's going to be a big machloket of Yev Shalom Midat between Rava and Abaye. It's the whole topic of the second side of Daf, or Daf today. What if we're still in this track of the owner despaired, I can pick it up. And now the question becomes, what if the owner shows up? And we saw this before, right? That I really don't have to return it because it's really ownerless at this point. If they despaired of getting their object back and then later said, oh, that's mine, it's not actually theirs anymore. But perhaps lifnim mishurat hadin, since I know it's theirs, maybe beyond the letter of the law, I should be returning it. Then we have the other track, which is I picked it up, okay? Or let's even go before I pick it up. I see this item. I think the owner didn't despair because it's a very special ring that, obviously they'll be able to get back with simanim. It's very unique. They can come declare it. But what's the problem? They have no idea where it is. Now here comes where the Torah says, lo tuchal lehitale. Not only can I pick it up, again, now the picking up is different. In the first case, I can pick it up because it's lost. Now I pick it up because it's lost, but I have to return it. And not only that, but I can't ignore it. I can't just say, oh, maybe someone else will deal with this. I have an obligation to be responsible and help somebody find their lost item. So then I have to pick it up. Now here come a whole bunch of questions, which is, well, number one, what determines when we assume the owner is not going to despair? What criteria do we have to determine that? Then we have a bunch of questions. What's my level of responsibility for the item once I pick it up? Am I allowed to use the item at all while I'm waiting for the original owner? And what steps do I have to take to find the owner? So these are all basic questions that we're going to see in this chapter. Let's start with our first Mishna. The first Mishna starts out like a typical style of Mishna. Elu mitziot shelo ve'elu chayav lachris. Gives a topic sentence, which we're going to see that we're really only going to deal with today, Elu mitziot shelo, and not the Elu chayav lachris. That's going to be the next Mishna. But first it tells us we're going to discuss items that I find in the street that become mine, that are ownerless, I can keep, And then we're going to get to Elo Chayav Lachriz. These are ones you need to announce about, meaning a few things. Number one, you have to pick them up, but you have to announce them to try to find who. You have an obligation to try to find the original owner. Let the original owner know that this object was lost and found and try to give it back to them. So now we're going to get into the list of Elo Metziot Shelo. Elo Metziot Shelo. So just in case you're not looking inside, it starts Elo Metziot Shelo, Elo Chayav Lachriz, and now it goes to Elo Metziot Shelo. These are the ones you get to keep, and that's all we're dealing with for today. Matzah perot mefuzarim. You see fruits, which really usually means grain, okay, like kernels of wheat strewn on the floor, or ma'ot mefuzarot, coins falling on the floor, kind of spread out, scattered. Krichot bereshut harabim, bundles of wheat in the public domain. Igulei dvela, pressed fig cakes. They would press figs and then they would make a cake out of it. You can find these, by the way, in the store. They sell these kind of things still, or something like it, where you see a lot of pressed figs together. They kind of, because they stick together, that's what it means a cake. It doesn't mean you made a cake with figs. It meant you press them together and they make this, it kind of looks like a cake. Kikarot shel nachtom, bakery bread. Bakery bread all looks the same. I mean, it doesn't always look the same, but there's very standard kind of bakery bread. You're going to see that all these cases are going to be compared to cases where the payroll are in it, the money is in an arrangement. The bread is homemade bread, which already everyone's homemade bread looks somewhat different than their friends. This is a string on which they would hang, or a rope where they would hang fish to sell or meat to sell, pieces of meat that were hanging. This is all like in the shuk, everyone's looks the same. It really looks no different. Bundles of wool that are taken from their country, their state. It sounds a little weird, that word. Some people explain it a little differently. What they mean really is it's unfinished. In other words, it wasn't turned into anything yet. It's in its more basic form. Some people explain the word medina in a different way, like as a bundle, which comes up in Shabbat Aflam Gimel, as the word is used as a bundle. Maybe that's the usage. Anitzei pishtan, also pieces of flax, like bundles of flax. Lishonot shel argaman. These are the very beautiful purple color of wool. Okay, so all this is basically very basic. They all look the same, and therefore there's no identifiable features, and therefore hooray elu shelo. You can keep these. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kol sheyesh bo shinui chayav lachriz. Rabbi Yehuda says if there's some sort of shinui, change, something different in any of these items, then you have to announce. The Gemara is going to explain later, not today, what's the difference, like what's the machloka between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda here. But what does Rabbi Yehuda say? What would be an example? Matzah igul ubetocho cheres. You found an igul dvela, one of these cakes, but inside there was a shard, okay, an earthenware shard. Why that would be, I don't know, but you had something in it that would identify it. Kikaru betocho ma'ot. You had a loaf of bread that had money inside. Why you would have that is a little strange. Some people maybe hid money in bread. It would be a weird place to hide money. I think I once had a case, I seem to remember, that we were bringing a cake to my grandmother's and then money fell in, or maybe someone brought us a cake. I don't know. I seem to remember some story where money actually fell into the cake. And so it could happen. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, third opinion here, which again, we don't really understand. And Rashi is going to say, oh, but Gemara mefaresh, okay, which means, okay, don't bother trying to understand it now. Kol klei anphoria. Okay, here's again another Greek word. Ein chayav lachriz. You don't have to announce. Okay, we don't know what this is. We'll leave it. We'll get to it in the Gemara later. For now, we're going to start with perot mefuzarim. Matzah perot mefuzarim. We're going to have a few questions here. Vikama. How many is considered perot mefuzarim? You have 100 oranges lying on the ground in a small space. That's going to really be called perot mefuzarim. So how many? And again, we're not talking about fruits like that. We're talking about grain, wheat kernels. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, kav ba'arba amot. The amount within a space. We need, right, both those numbers. How much in what area of space? So 1 kav, that's a measure of volume, of wheat kernels in a space of 4 cubits. 4 means 4 by 4, okay? 4 and 4 cubits. So the Gemara asks, hechidami, what exactly is the case? Okay, we have a few questions. Number 1, how many, in what space, and how were they left? Those are our 3 questions. If they fell, afilu tuvanami, even more than that. In other words, the assumption is if it fell, then it does. Even if you have more than a kav, no one's going to come back for that. Like your wheat, fell all over the ground. You're obviously not coming back. If it was placed there, then probably the owner's coming back for it, and therefore even less than a kav and 4 amot, you're going to come back and collect. So, what is the answer? We must be talking about stuff you left on the threshing floor. When you would do the threshing, you would end up with, that's when we'd separate the wheat from the chaff, and then you collect your kernels. Now, if you took all your kernels out and left, this sounds like the halachas of leket, when you're in the field and you're collecting, you leave some behind. So if you left a kav in a space of 4 cubits, kav ba'arbamot dinafesh tirchayu, it's too much of a pain to start collecting that amount. Lo tarach inish v'lo hadar ati v'shakaluhu. You're not going to bother. It's not worth the bother. So if when you took everything off the threshing floor, you left behind a kav of kernels in a space of 4 cubits, it's too much of a pain to collect that. It's too scattered for too small an amount. Okay, it's all a matter of, right, what's the amount versus the space in which it is. So now this, you can already see the difference between this and falling and this and putting down. In this case, right, you left it there. In other words, and we're going to call it in a minute. Where is the word? Avedamidat. I don't remember where it says it, but it's going to say, basically, that's something that you leave behind on purpose. That's called a lost item that I didn't lose. I don't know where it is. I know exactly where it is, but I left it. So that's hefker. That's when I could take peirot mefusalin. So by the way, that already limits the Mishna, very much so. It's not like I just found stuff on the road. It's, or, in the middle of the street. I found it in the threshing floor that someone left behind. So again, let's start from so kav and 4 amot, it's too much of a pain. Nafesh tirchayu. Lo tarach inish, I'm not going to bother. Below hadar ati shakalu, and I'm not going to go back and pick it up. I just went back over the words we saw before, and therefore, therefore, I'm going to just despair from it. I'm going to say, this is now ownerless. So therefore, if you find it, you see my threshing floor, and you see this kav in 4 amot, you could take it. But sir mehachi, but if it's in a space that's less than that, tarach, I will bother, because it's not so hard to collect a kav within 2 by 4, let's say. And therefore I'll go back and take it, and therefore lo mafkalu, and therefore I didn't make it ownerless. So that's our answer. But here comes Rabbi Yirmia, our favorite Rabbi Yirmia, and I think this is the first sugya I remember learning Rabbi Yirmia and kind of seeing who and what he was all about. So comes Rabbi Yirmia with a slew of questions, although I did see that some commentaries say that some of these questions are added by other people later, and they just sort of got strung together because there's really no purpose for all the questions. Although, from Rabbi Yirmia, he likes to ask questions, even if he's already kind of asked them before, or they're not exactly necessary. And it's the classic Rabbi Yirmia that's going to end with a teku. So comes Rabbi Yirmia and asks the following question. By Rabbi Yirmia. What if you have half a kav in a space of 2 cubits? So it's the same ratio, right? And now all these questions are going to go back to these 2 big questions, these 2 options. This whole thing of kav and 4 amot is the issue that it's too much of a pain to collect, or is the issue that it's not important enough? In other words, obviously it's both. It's not important enough to collect. The effort is not worth what you're going to gain from it. So the question is, what if we could find a case where we change one parameter but not the other? And then what would be the case? So now we have to understand what first of all, what's chatzi kav in 2 cubits? It's not 2 by 2. 2 by 2 would be not the same ratio, right? It'd have to be 2 by 4. 2 by 4 is half of 4 by 4. So even though it says 2, and before it said 4, 4 meant 4 by 4, 2 is going to mean 2 by 2. When we get to 8, it's going to be 8 by 4, okay? So if you have half a kav in 2 cubits, so 2 by 4 space, which is going to be the same ratio as 1 kav to 4 cubits, mahu, so we're going to say, kav ba'arba motam amayim b'shum denafish tirchayu. It's too much of a pain because it's spread out in a space of 4 cubits, 4 by 4, and therefore, chatzi kav b'shtei amot, kevan lo nafish tirchayu, but here you have half a kav, but it's in a space of, right, it might be the same ratio, but it's in a much smaller space. It's in half a size, it's half the space. So maybe you'd say, if it's in a smaller area, it's not so hard. And I'm thinking of broken glass, right? When broken glass shatters all over your room, it's much more complicated to clean up. If it shatters in a very small space, somehow you got lucky, and when it fell, it didn't shatter all over the place, it's not as hard to clean up. So maybe it's not so hard to clean up, in which case you'll pick up, in which case maybe you won't just say, oh, this is ownerless, I'm not going to bother. Oh, Dilma, or do you say Mishum Dilo Chashive, or do you say that kind of, it's just not, one kav is just not important enough. It's just not that, okay, you lost a kav. Well, then chatzi kav, b'shtei amot, all the more so. Half a kav, if one kav is important enough to go back and collect, half a kav for sure is not that important. So maybe you'll just say, it's not worth my effort for half a kav, even though the effort might be less. So which is the more important issue? Second question. Kabayim b'shmona amot ma'u. 2 kav in 8. Again, 8 by 4. So where it's double the amount of space, but also double the amount of grains. So again, kav in 4 cubits, it's because it's a pain. 2 kav to collect in a space of 8 cubits is even bigger space. It's more of a pain. Since it's more of a pain to collect, for sure you're going to make it ownerless. Oh, Dilma mishum de l'chashive. Or maybe you say it's because a kav is just not important enough. Kabayim b'shmonamo keman d'chashive lo mifkalu. But 2 kav already is a significant amount. You're not going to just let that go. So maybe you will collect it. Next question. Kav shum shemim ba'arba amot mahu. Sesame. We're going to see that sesame was very valued in their time. So kav ba'arba amot tamamai. So now we're keeping the amount the same, kav to 4 cubits, but we're changing what it is. Instead of grains, it's now sesame. So sesame seeds, if you drop them, now try to imagine dropping and cleaning up sesame seeds, right? It's much more difficult than cleaning kernels of, grains, which are also small, but not like sesame seeds. So would you say, mishum de lo chashive, v'shum kevan de chashive lo mifkalu? A kav of grains is really not that valuable, but a kav of sesame is more valuable. So maybe you would collect it. You don't want to lose on that. Or do you say because it's a pain and hard to collect? Now, shumshimin, right? Koshken shumshimin, but it's way more difficult to clean up. So maybe for sure you would say, I'm not bothering. Kav tamre ba'arbamo, kav rimone ba'arbamo. Now we get to things that are much easier to clean up. Dates or pomegranates, which, they're very big. They're much easier to clean up. A kav of pomegranates, right, is much. There's like a few pomegranates in a kav. So, mahu. Kav ba'arbamo tamamai mishum de lo chashive. Kav tamre ba'arbamo, kav rimone ba'arbamo nami. Keman de lo chashive mifkalu. Interesting. Dates and rimon and pomegranates were considered not important, right? Nowadays, I would say those are probably more important than sesame seeds. But in those days, sesame seeds were more important. These were not as important. Could be because maybe they made tchina with sesame seeds and like other things with them. Halva, it's possible they made all those foods, and because of that, sesame seeds were used in production of items. Just like olives are very important because we made olive oil out of them. Whereas the fruits you just eat as fruits, maybe they have less value. So now they say, would you say because, right, these are not so important, so a kav of grains and a kav of dates, it's just not worth it. So you leave it behind. Oh, Dilma, or maybe it's because it's hard to collect all those grains from the ground. But but it's really not hard to collect. So maybe you wouldn't make them ownerless, and the answer is teku. We don't really know. Is it because they're not important, it's not enough of an amount that's important, or is it because it's too much of a pain? Right? Obviously, it's both, but the question is which one is more important. If we switch one issue and only have that issue and isolate the issue, would it be any different? And we don't have an answer. Okay, now we go to the real meat and potatoes of our daf today, which is Itmar, a very famous machloket, and one of the reasons why this is famous is because it's in the Ya'al Kegam, it's the Yud in Ya'al Kegam, which are, if you remember, the 6 cases where we paskin like Abaye instead of Rava. Always we paskin like Rava, but sometimes we paskin like Abaye in those 6 cases. Homework for today, go look up what all the cases of Ya'al Kegam are, see if you can remember the ones that we did already. So now comes the machloket. Abaye Amal Loha. So Yehush Shalomidad. Let's talk about what Yehush Shalomidad is. Kind of mentioned it before, but now let's go into it. So Rashi explains. Let's read Rashi, although there could be some other explanations of this exactly. But Yehush Shalomidad. Davar shestamo Yehush l'chishiyada shenafal mimenu. We can make assumptions about people. We can make it just like we did with the Perot Mefuzalin. We assume that when you find out this item is lost, okay, now the case of the Perot wasn't you found out, you left it behind. But let's say you lose it on the street. We assume that when you find out, you will say, I'm never getting that item back, and you will have Yeush. But what's the issue? What is Yeush Shalomi Dat? Now, I find this item on the street. Let's say it's a $100 bill. Now, I know that when you lost your $100 bill in the middle of Manhattan, you definitely are going to have Yeush when you realize you lost it. There's no way you're going to get it back. It happened to my husband the other day. He walked out with some money. He came home. He said, I lost 200 shekels somewhere. I don't know where, and like he's immediately, there was no way he was ever going to get that money back. So when you find it, Adayin lo yadu abalim shenafal mehem. But now, who finds that 200 shekel bill on the floor? Okay, somebody picked it up, saw it, found it, likely picked it up. On what basis can they pick it up? Well, what will they say? Obviously, when the owner realizes that they lost it, they'll have Yeush. But what's the problem? The problem is that when they find it, let's say my husband dropped the 200 shekel. Now, he only realized when he went to pay something and saw he didn't have his money on him. That could have been 20 minutes. It could have been 5 minutes. It could have been an hour. What happens if it happened an hour later that he noticed the money was missing? So he has Yeush in an hour. But at the moment that he dropped it, somebody picks it up. Let's say they picked it up 5 minutes later. They have no idea whether, right? And in fact, in this case, let's say he only realized an hour later. Well, they already picked it up, but they picked it up. It wasn't ownerless because he didn't have Yeush yet. So that's what it means, Yeush Shalomi Dat. It means the Lomi Dat means the finder doesn't know if there was Yeush or not. Okay? So now, first of all, you would never really, it's very complicated because how do you know? They have no idea what time my husband realized that he lost the money, how long was going to transpire between the time it was dropped to the time. They don't know when it was dropped. They don't know. Makes all this picking up lost items very complicated. So let's see what they say about it. Yeush Shalomi Dat, Abaye Amar lo have a Yeush. Abaye says, unless you know the owner despaired, then it's going to be an issue. In case I didn't say so, we're in Amud Bet now. So Abaye basically says, this is not Yeush. When you know the owner despaired, then there's Yeush. Now we're going to have a slew of questions on Abaye. First, starting with all the cases in our Mishna. Never said in the Mishna, you have to assume the person had Yeush. How do you pick up these items off the ground? So we'll have to deal with it. Rava Amal have a Yeush. Rava says no. If someone later down the road is going to have Yeush, and it's kind of like braita, although the commentaries try to figure out why it's not exactly braita and why they don't use that terminology here. But what's braita? Retroactive designation. When an hour later, my husband had Yeush and Seth said, oh, I lost that 200 shekel bill and obviously said, I'm never getting it back. Well, then when the person picked it up an hour before, or let's say 55 minutes before, 5 minutes after he dropped it, at that point, when an hour later, my husband says, oh, I dropped that money, I'm never getting it back. So it kicks in retroactively that there was Yeush from then, because had he known earlier, it would have been Yeush. Now, it's interesting. You would think that we would hold like Rava in this case, but we don't. We hold like Abaye. So now we're going to have to figure out, though, and this might help us a little bit with figuring out what kind of items are easier to take. We're now going to say that the machloket's not across the board. It sort of depends on the scenario. So now we're going to say two situations where they would each agree to both extremes. Yes, you can take it. No, you can't take it. B'davar sheyesh bo siman, if it has a siman, an identifying mark, and you find it on the street, everyone agrees there's no Yeush in that case. And even if you were to, let's say you lost a fancy ring. Okay, so now, maybe after a year, you have Yeush, okay? But if I picked it up a year before, right, when it was lost, and I didn't find you anymore, or again, it's not clear what exactly happened here, but let's say I pick it up and you later have Yeush, that doesn't help, okay? Why? This is very interesting. Lo have a Yeush. Even though later they despair. Now, that's usually what happens with theft, remember? In a theft case, I steal it. You don't have Yeush right away. But we assume that after I stole it, you're going to have Yeush. And then we learned that if I sell it to someone else, there's Yeush and Shino Reshut, and then it works, okay? So we're going to get back into Yeush again, and perhaps later also compare things to Gzela, to theft. But even though you heard to Miyayish Levasof, you know that the person eventually despaired, lo have a yesh. We don't count this as yesh. And here comes a big line. Because when it got to your hands, it was forbidden for it to get to your hands. You weren't allowed to take it because it had a siman. This is a very problematic line. What do you mean you weren't allowed to take it? It was b'isur. It's not like you stole it. When you stole it, it was b'isur. And that's why you're, right? It's not really yours. You always have to return the value to the, right? And that's because takanat shavim. Okay, I'm not going to go all back to Bava Kama. But according to this, you picked it up. It was a ring that had a siman. You can't keep that for yourself ever, even if later the owners give up of ever getting them back. So Gefed is back now, the Shiurim from Yeshivat Trisha, and Rabbi Shimoni, you'll hopefully get to listen later. It's not up yet on the site. It will be up later today, B'ezrat Hashem. She talks about this line because it's a very difficult line because there's a few problems with this line, and she raises all the questions at the beginning of her shiur. I might not remember all of them, but the two major questions I can remember are like this. Number one, who says it's b'isur? You picked it up in order to return it. That's not b'isur. That's not, you didn't do anything wrong. You picked it up in order to return it. And then what? We're going to say this ring will never, ever be yours, like 13, 15 years later, 20 years later, what? The person is never going to want to get back. It'll never be yours. So anyway, there's a big machlok at Ramban and Tosfot about how to understand this line, and I highly recommend you listen to the shiur because it's very interesting. But for our purposes, we're going to try to understand it as simply as possible, which is Yeyosh doesn't work according to anybody in this case, because when you picked it up, the assumption was the person was not going to despair because it had an identifying mark. And therefore, Isura maybe is translated somewhat loosely, but you weren't supposed to get it as your own in the beginning, so therefore it won't become yours even down the road. Memra Amra, that's because the owner will say, Simane lebegave. I have an identifying mark on this ring. I know I can identify it if somebody finds it. Yavina siman v'shakil nale. I'll give a siman. I'll get it back. Okay. Bezuto shel yam, second case. Ubeshluto shel nahar. Bezuto shel yam. There's different interpretations of what this means. The depths of the sea, whether it means the where the river goes into the sea, where it's the strongest current. Some place where it gets into the water, where you see it fall in the water, and you realize, you know, the puddle of the stream, somewhere it goes into somewhere where there's a current running, and you're never, or it's very deep, the ocean, you're never going to get this back. Afagav de ipe siman Rahman Asharya. Even though it has an identifying mark, the Torah says you can take this. We're going to prove this later on, so we'll leave this case for later. Kipligi, in which case do they disagree? So in other words, we saw two extremes. One where you'll never be able to get it according to everyone, and one where you will obviously be able to get it according to everybody. But what's the machlok between Rav and Abaye? They're arguing over a case where there is no siman. And Abaye says, Lo avi yeyush. It's not yeyush because the person doesn't even know. So they didn't do yeyush yet. It has owner right now when you picked it up. Rav Amar have a yeyush. Why? Because when you find out later, you will definitely despair. And therefore, right, Meimar Amar, and why will you definitely despair? Because Meimar Amar, Simana lately bigave. You'll say, I don't have a siman. I don't have a way to get it back. And therefore, it's as if they were miyayish now. They despaired from the beginning. Now we're going to start with a slew of questions against Abaye. Only the last one is going to be a question against Rava, and we're going to continue with a slew of questions also in tomorrow's daf. So we're going to start with, there's a siman for all this list of questions. You can see it's a very long list. It's a lot of letters there that are abbreviations for the each case. Anyway, we're going to skip the abbreviation part. Tashma. Let's learn from here. And we're going to start with our Mishna. Peirot mefuzalim. Halo yada dinafel mine. Peirot, strewn on the street. Nobody knows that they fell. So how on earth can you pick them up? According to Abaye, they say that's not a question. Ha'amar Rav Ukma Brachama. It says bizre, but it should be beidre, like we saw on the previous page. So it's in the threshing floor where, here's the word I was looking for before, the avedami dati. This is what we call an avedami dat. This is a known aveda. This means I'm particularly leaving it behind. Right? I collected all my stuff. Some of it stayed on the ground. I left it there on purpose. That's called an avidami dat. I'm losing it for myself. I don't want it. That clearly there is yeyush, and therefore this is not a question at all. Tashma ma'o mefuzarot hare'elu shelo. You find money scattered, you can take it. Amai. Halo yada dinafil mine. What case with my husband? He didn't even realize he dropped it. Well, they don't agree with me. They say, Hatam Nami kid Rabbi Yitzchak. They're going to say, just like Rabbi Yitzchak answers further on in the page in a different source. He says the following: people check their wallets all the time. Okay, kol sha'ah doesn't mean once an hour. It means all the time. People are always checking their bag. I was trying to think of an example where, like, you might, I don't know, I was thinking if you travel with jewelry, let's say, and you have your jewelry in your pocketbook, or on the airplane, like you're always checking, my pocketbook's here, right? My pocketbook's here. There's that feeling of, I hope all my stuff is here, my passport, all my important documents. So you're always checking. So you notice right away, which means that as soon as someone finds it on the floor, we assume, here comes the big thing for Abaye. You're going to have to make certain assumptions. We assume the person knows already. So if you find it on the ground, you can assume the person knows right away. So just like he said it, explaining some other source, Hachanami, he would say the same thing here. Tashma, next one. Those fig cakes and the bread, how can you pick them up? Amai. How do you know they fell? These are heavy. Because they're heavy, people know, because you're carrying a bag, and all of a sudden it's not as heavy it was a minute ago. You notice that, so you'll notice that you drop it. Tashma l'shanot shel argaman harei elu shelo. Amai halo yada dinafo me. We just keep doing the same thing. What about that purple wool? Hatamnami agav dechashive mashmushe memashesh bu kedu Rabbi Yitzchak. Again, we're going to take Rabbi Yitzchak claim about the money. These were expensive wool, and this was expensive wool, and therefore you're going to notice. Now we're off the Mishna, we're on to a braita. If you find money in the shuls or in the Beit Midrash, okay, or in any public place, you get to keep them because the owners don't expect to get them. There's a lot of people there. But how do they know? And this is where Rabbi Yitzchak said it. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and then we quoted it and we copied it to the other cases. That Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Adam Asur L'Mishmesh B'Kiso B'Kol Sha'ah V'Sha'ah, and therefore they know. Tashma, Me'ematai Kol Adam Mutarim B'Leket. When can we assume that after the people collected in the fields, the leket that you left for the poor people, at this point it becomes hefker because no more poor people are coming. What's that stage? It's a Mishna in Peah, Mishil Chuba HaNimushot. When the Nimushot are done. Now, Amrina, my Nimushot, what are Nimushot? There's two opinions. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Sabe da'az le'atikra. They're the elderly who walk with canes. And what's the issue with them? They walk very slowly. Okay, people who walk fast miss things, but the people who walk slowly don't miss anything, and therefore they actually get all the bundles. Anything left after that, no one's coming for them anymore. And also they're the slowest, so they come last. And then once they go, everything becomes hefker and ownerless, and anyone can take it. Rish Lakish amar likute batar likute. It's after 2 rounds of poor people who have come into the field. We assume no one's coming anymore. Amai. But wait, the leket is owned by all the poor people in the world. So the fact that 2 batches of people came, or the elderly people came, let's try to go with the 2 rounds of people. Just because 2 rounds of people came doesn't mean there's not going to be another round of people. There's still poor people out there who might come, to which they tell you something about their system, how people would take. Amre kevan diika aniyim hacha hanach miikare yushem yashev amre aniyim dahata melachtele. All the poor people had their turf. They knew that the people who live near here, they collect there. The people there, they collect there. So basically, you knew as a poor person that once 2 rounds of people went, like that's their turf. You don't go in their turf. So you wouldn't collect leket there. And that's why we can assume after 2 rounds, no one else is going to come. And that's why it's obvious there's Yeush at that point. So all these cases, since we're now done with Abaye and we're going to move to Rava, all these cases right now, what we did was we basically explained that it's obvious in these cases that there's going to be Yeush. And not later, but now, or right, that at this point there's Yeush. Tashma, what about this source? Tziot baderech, v'afilu b'tzad steak tziot. We're now talking about figs, dried figs. Do you have a place where you dry figs? And now we find either dried figs in the street, or we find them in the street, but right next to a field where they were drying figs. You have a fig tree that's hanging over the public domain, and you find figs underneath. Mutarot mishum gezel, you can take them, and you're not going to be liable for stealing. And pturot min ha'maaser, and they're exempt from maaser because they're hefker. whoever's there, they know people are going to take them. So they're hefker. If it's hefker, you don't have to take tithes. But if it's the same with a olive tree or a carob tree, it's forbidden. So bishlam areisha Abaye lo kasha. According to Abaye, we're not going to ask about the beginning. It's not really difficult because we could answer like we did the others. You have your field where your figs are drying. You know exactly at all points how many figs you have. They're very important to you. First of all, you took the effort to dry them out. Therefore, you'll know when they're missing right away, and then you'll have yeyush because you know they went in the street and someone will probably take them. Well, your fig tree, figs fall off very easily from the tree, so you know they're going to fall and you know people will then take them. So here it's kind of like yeush merosh. You kind of say from the beginning, any figs that fall from my tree into the street, I know people are going to take and they're not mine. But ela seifa l'Rava kasha. Because what does it say in the Sefer? It says olives and carobs are forbidden. Why are they forbidden? Right? Obviously, when you eventually find out they fell, you're going to have yeush. To which they answer, Amar Rabbi Yabau, Shani Zayid, Ho'il v'chazuto mochiach halav. V'afagav denatrin zayte, made the idea, duchti deinish inishu. Everybody knows these are my olives. First of all, the space, they fall right by my tree. And my olives look different from your olives. And therefore, everyone knows that they're mine. And therefore, I'm not going to have yeush because they're going to return them to me. To which the Gemara says, well, then how do you explain the difference between the figs and the olives? To which Amar Papa, figs get ruined when they fall. Okay, I have a starfruit tree. The second they fall, they get ruined. They're done. So if I had that tree and it was in the public domain, as soon as they would fall, first of all, the ones in my garden, I don't even want anymore once they fall. Certainly if they're outside, I have yeush on them. So that's because they get ruined. But if you have, we all know there's fruits that don't get ruined when they fall. And therefore, those fruits, no one has yeush on. And that's the difference between the olives, carobs, right? You can see carob is really hard, and olives also. They don't get ruined when they fall. So there's no yeush. So that's the difference between the two. And there won't even be yeush down the road. And that's why Rava would explain that it's forbidden to take. So what did we do today? We finished up the last two questions on Rava about the simpon, and we resolved that, and then went into depth a little bit into one of the sources. Then we started with our Mishnah. What items do you have to return? Do not have to return. Which items can you keep? We went through the whole list. Then we started explaining what's peirot mufuzari, what ratio of how much to what space. We had all those crazy Rabbi Yirmia questions. And then we went to this big machlok at Rava and Abaye about yeush shelo midat. Is it valid? Is it not valid? Abaye doesn't think so. Rava does. And then we brought a slew of questions, most of them against Abaye. And we had to explain that in those cases, you can assume the yeush happened immediately. And that's why you're allowed to take those items. And then we had that last one, which was a question on Rava, and we resolved it. That's it for today. Wishing everyone a good day and besorot tovat.